Welcome to the Jaco Report. I'm Charles Jaco. The IRS targets the Tea Party and other conservative political groups. Shades of Richard Nixon and his infamous enemies list, or a low-level foul-up. We talk about it with a former IRS insider and the head of the St. Louis Tea Party. The Jaco Report will be back with that in just a couple of minutes. Please stay with us. Welcome back to the Jaco Report. This is the week the Obama administration went into damage control and fired the acting IRS chief over the targeting of Tea Party and other conservative political groups by federal tax collectors. The Internal Revenue Service revealed that agents were targeting Tea Party and other organizations for claiming tax-exempt status under Section 501c4 of the tax code. Now, that section was traditionally used by charitable or educational groups for tax exemption, but more and more political groups have filed under that. Now, the president has said targeting conservative groups is an outrage, but Republicans say it's an enemies list scandal rivaling anything Richard Nixon did. So is it that? Or is it just a screw-up by over-enthusiastic low-level workers, or is it something completely different? Joining us to talk about it today are Bill Hennessy and James Cutten. Bill Hennessy is executive director of the St. Louis Tea Party. Jim Cutten is a tax attorney with a St. Louis firm, the Tax Controversy Law Firm. He worked in the office of the IRS Chief Counsel for 30 years. Gentlemen, welcome aboard. Bill, question for you. St. Louis Tea Party, what was your experience with the IRS in this? They didn't come after you, but your application was in limbo? Yeah,
we've been waiting about a year and a half now to hear anything. We've gotten absolutely nothing from them, and the problem with that is it makes us very hesitant to pursue fundraising. You know, we don't want to do too much and find out we're in the wrong status.
So, Jim, tell me. We talked on the phone earlier, and you said some very interesting things from your 3 decades and at the IRS, but I think the big takeaway for me is, given the culture of the IRS, you did not believe this was some kind of gigantic targeted conspiracy from the top, but rather was much, much, much further down the food chain. Explain that.
That is correct. As a matter of fact, I have the Treasurer Inspector General for Tax Administration, the TIDCA report, which was released May 14th, just a few days ago, and it specifically states that it exonerates upper-level management at the Commissioner's Office of the Internal Revenue Service, and it states that decisions were made at the Determinations Office, which was a group in Cincinnati charged with reviewing applications for exempt status.
Now, this was done, I take it, because there had been a flood of applications for this particular tax-exempt status after a couple of Supreme Court rulings included Citizens United?
Well, I believe that is correct in part, but generally, prior to an election, there is a substantial increase in PACs and political organizations applying for exempt organization status. And the question then is, are they entitled to Section 501c3 status, as some of them apparently applied for, or Section 501c4 status? And the difference is instrumental, because if they get 501c3 status, the donor is entitled to deduct the contribution, and that is totally wrong under the tax law. So the Internal Revenue Service was correct in its thoroughness of its review as to the code section or subsection of its exempt status. Now, the Internal Revenue Service was also incorrect in that it targeted certain groups, and it should not target groups based upon affiliation or profile is the more correct term, and it really is a matter of sensitivity, and it's slowed down the process.
Bill, those of us of a certain age can remember Richard Nixon's administration when government agencies like the IRS were essentially used as a political cudgel. Do you get the same feeling from this, despite the idea that this might have been something low level, that it was not groups like Organizing for America on the liberal side who were targeted, it was you guys?
Correct. You know, and you know, with all due respect to the Treasury IG, he works for the guy whose political opponents were targeted. So you know, you can take the Treasury IG's report with a grain of salt. When an independent counsel looks into this, I'll be more satisfied with the results.
Jim, what about that? If you know, this takes us back to the kind of things we dealt with 30, 40 years ago with the Nixon administration. If this was simply a low-level over-enthusiasm, How do you restore confidence of people in an organization that most Americans don't particularly care for in the first place, the IRS?
Well, after what happened in the Nixon administration, there were changes to the tax law which brought about the Privacy Act and financial disclosure rules, which is Section 6103 of the Internal Revenue Code, where if you receive taxpayer information or tax returns, copies of tax return or tax return information, you have to have a need to know. Not even a congressman or the White House can receive this information from the Internal Revenue Service unless they have a need to know. They're involved in that particular case or that particular transaction. The IRS is prohibited from sharing information with other aspects of the federal government.
What does the report say anything about the motivation of the employees in Cincinnati of going after only conservative groups and not, say, instead of searching by Tea Party or Patriots, just searching by incorporation date to bring everybody under it?
The IG report indicates that the employees in Cincinnati, you had phrases that they were looking at for, be on the lookout for, and code words. And as a result of that, the Internal Revenue Service at the national office has issued instructions, and they are following the TIDCA recommendation that future review based upon on the lookout for particular types of words have to be approved by the national office in Washington. So when a field office is using a criteria to select, that has to be previously approved in Washington, D.C. Now, these are new procedures.
Right. Now, Bill, the question for you is, okay, your guys' application is still hanging fire. But this has, in a way, had a chilling effect on your political speech, has it not, in that it's created problems with fundraising?
Absolutely. You can't move forward without the, I mean, I suppose you could and cross your fingers.
If people say, well, look, I'll just give you the money, whether it's, whether you're
exactly
that way or not, I'll just give you the money.
Exactly. And, but it's also done other things. You know, there's Frank Vandersloot in Idaho, I believe, who was targeted on the Obama campaign website, and then he's hit with 3 audits in a row. No finding of any, he was not hit with a penalty or a single fine, but it cost him $80,000 in his reputation. He was identified as a shady character. The other problem is that just to say, you're limited in what you can do. You're limited in the activities you can go, and we're primarily about trying to draw a larger group. It's very difficult to do when you can't raise money to do that.
Jim, one of the things that strikes me here, and this may be outside your purview as somebody who deals with tax law, is that because there was a chilling effect on First Amendment rights because of this, in terms of fundraising and other things, that this is, even if it was a low-level screw-up, that this is astonishingly serious stuff. Does any of it rise to the level of criminality?
My opinion, no. Now, of course, Congress may change the law. And, for example, I mentioned improper disclosure, changing the law after the Nixon administration. And if there is improper disclosure, that can be a criminal violation, as well as giving civil penalties against the employee. IRS employees receive a lot of ethics training. What I envision as a result of this will be additional ethics training. And I believe that the IRS will use this as a jumping off board to be a better organization in the future. The IRS has stated that they're going to adopt the Inspector General recommendations and be a better organization in the future. Should changes be made? Well, that's up to Congress and not for me. That's a political issue. But I will say that when an organization applies for exempt status, there should perhaps be an investigation if they are exempt or not. And more important is whether or not the exempt status should be under Section 501c3 or 4.
And I don't think anybody's arguing with that. I think
no.
That, the idea is that if everybody comes under it, then everybody should. Bill, final word for you now. You're doubtful that this was simply low level. You're suspicious that this must go higher. What would you guys like to see done with this? You mentioned an independent counsel.
That would be the first step. There's got to be somebody from outside of the administration and outside of Congress who looks into this and investigates it and finds out what was going on. The timing is extremely suspicious that everyone in the IRS and apparently in Treasury knew about this before the election, but it doesn't come out until well after the election. Things like that are only going to be satisfied if there's an independent counsel looking at it.
Bill, thank you very much for coming in.
Thank you.
Jim, my pleasure. Thank you for being with us. We hope you can be with us next Sunday morning for another edition of the Jaco Report.